The desert wind whispered over the rusted edges of a forgotten gold mine in western Burkina Faso, carrying the scent of history, betrayal, and something new, power shifting beneath the surface. A lone black SUV pulled up near the mine entrance. Dust rose as two silhouettes stepped out. One was a tall American in a crisp blue suit, his sunglasses glinting like knives. The other, shorter, broader, in military fatigues, calm, measured, watching. Scott Bessent had arrived with promises polished in Wall Street boardrooms. "We can develop this place," he said, voice as smooth as the silk tie fluttering in the wind. "With American capital, your country could become the Dubai of West Africa." He smiled, expecting awe, expecting gratitude. He found neither. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood silently, boots planted in the red earth like roots. His gaze wasn't one of rejection, but of calculation. And in that quiet moment, Bessent sensed it, this wasn't just another desperate leader seeking a savior. This man had no intention of being saved. He had come to weigh the cost of domination, and reject it. Bessent opened a metal briefcase. Inside were glossy documents, mineral projections, international partner contracts. "This is your golden ticket," he said. "Sign here, and you'll be in the fold." Traoré didn't blink. "You mean back in the cage," he replied coldly. For a second, Bessent's charm cracked. He adjusted his tie. "You don't understand the scale of what's being offered. This isn't just business. This is destiny." Traoré stepped closer, close enough that Bessent could see the faint scar along his jaw. "I do understand," he said, voice low. "I understand this gold built your empires, funded your wars, and silenced our voices. Not anymore." Then he turned, not away, but toward a convoy arriving behind them. Trucks filled with engineers, surveyors, and soldiers, not American, but African. Independent. United. As the sun dipped behind the Sahel hills, it cast long shadows, shadows of a new order rising. Scott Bessent was left staring, stunned, as Traoré walked toward the mine without him. Not a deal signed, not a single word more. Just the message that echoed across the dust and stone. "If you want Africa's gold, you better move faster. Because we already did." 2 days after Traoré rejected the offer, Bessent was back, but not alone. This time, the American didn't bring contracts. He brought a convoy of armored SUVs, State Department aides, and a private security detail that moved like a mercenary shadow. The air around the capital was tense, dripping not with fear, but with fire. At a private airstrip outside Ouagadougou, a tent had been set up for a diplomatic roundtable. But everyone in the room knew it was a last chance to make Traoré bend. Bessent sat across from him, this time flanked by 2 former military officials turned economic advisors. Their presence was no accident. "Captain," Bessent said, his tone sharper now, "there are consequences to defiance. The global market has rules, and those who break them, get broken." Traoré didn't flinch. "So now you threaten Africa with collapse, for refusing to be looted?" One of the men to Bessent's right leaned forward. "No threats, just facts. America ensures stability. Without us, chaos wins." Traoré's eyes narrowed. He placed a small metal box on the table and opened it. Inside was a chunk of raw gold, fresh from the mines. "You built your stability on this," he said. "You paid dictators with this, bought silence, funded coups, built empires of debt." The room went quiet. The Americans exchanged looks. Traoré wasn't speaking like a soldier. He was speaking like a storm. "You want access," he continued. "Come with respect, with partnership. Not boots and briefcases." One of the aides laughed nervously. "And if we don't?" Traoré's hand closed the box slowly. "Then you won't get anything." As the Americans stood to leave, frustrated and rattled, a siren echoed outside the tent. A line of cargo trucks passed, each labeled in bold letters, "Shipped to Turkey, gold and rare earth." Not the US. Not France. Not Britain. Bessent's jaw tightened. "You're choosing enemies over allies." Traoré stood. "I'm choosing sovereignty over slavery." Before anyone could reply, the flap of the tent opened, and in walked a Chinese delegate and a Qatari investor. Smiling, shaking Traoré's hand. Scott Bessent didn't see a third-world strongman anymore. He saw the man who just shut America out of the vault. The next morning, Traoré stepped out into the dry morning air of Ouagadougou, his boots crunching against the gravel courtyard outside the presidential compound. In his hand, he held a thick file, one filled with intelligence reports not yet public. Names, locations, quantities, timestamps. Everything Scott Bessent assumed was hidden. It wasn't. Inside the secure briefing room, Traoré laid the file before his military council and economic advisors. "He's not coming for peace," Traoré said, his voice low but sharp. "He's coming for everything." Bessent had moved faster than expected. Under the shell of foreign infrastructure development projects, his network had been quietly mapping mineral routes, not just gold, but lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements critical to Western tech. These weren't just economic moves, they were strategic plays, and Traoré understood the board better than most. Across the table, Colonel Zango leaned forward. "We could nationalize the entire sector, strip the licenses. Send a message." Traoré didn't respond right away. He looked out the window, where a group of children were playing soccer beside an armored vehicle. "No," he finally said. "We let him think we're negotiating. Then we take the board off the table entirely." Meanwhile, in Washington, Bessent was already calling in favors. Senators, lobbyists, even private security contractors. One document in the folder listed a scheduled meeting between Bessent and former CIA operatives now embedded in mining security firms. This wasn't diplomacy. It was siege warfare, just with suits and contracts instead of guns, for now. Traoré turned to his communications chief. "Set the stage. I want a televised speech by Friday. No more backroom whispers. We go public." "What message should we send?" she asked. Traoré looked into the camera as if it were already live. "Tell the world," he said. "Africa's gold will not be taken in silence." And somewhere in Manhattan, Scott Bessent's phone vibrated. A single notification. The title of Traoré's upcoming address. "Blood for gold? Over our dead bodies." The sun had barely set when the courtyard of Burkina Faso's presidential palace came alive with camera crews, satellite trucks, and foreign correspondents scrambling for position. Traoré's announcement had shaken not only Bessent but also the diplomatic backchannels of Paris, London, and Washington. No one expected him to go public. No one expected him to roar. Inside the palace, as final checks were made, Traoré adjusted the cuffs of his uniform. His advisors, flanking him with silent resolve, knew this wasn't just another press statement, it was a declaration of economic sovereignty. A line in the sand. The speech began not with rage, but with reverence. "When our ancestors mined gold," Traoré said into the lens, "they wore no suits, held no stocks, and made no deals with colonizers. They held the earth in their hands, and they guarded it with their lives." He paused. The room fell into stillness. "But today," he continued, "men in skyscrapers think they can own what we bleed for. They draw borders with money. They send lawyers before soldiers. And they call it development." From the control room, an aide whispered, "We're trending in 25 countries." The speech intensified. "To Scott Bessent and his empire of theft, Africa is not your gold mine. You do not get to decide which veins we open, which nations we sell, which leaders we keep or remove. Those days are over." In a flash, the screen behind Traoré lit up, satellite images of illegal mining sites connected to foreign shell companies, with coordinates pinned. Evidence. Hard and cold. "This is what you call investment?" he asked, turning to the images. "Then call this our response." He stepped forward, eyes locked on the world. Effective immediately, all foreign mining contracts in Burkina Faso are suspended. Licenses will be re-evaluated under sovereign review. If you are in our land without honor, without law, without consent, you will leave. Or be removed. The last words hit like thunder. If it's gold you want, then come take it. Let the world see who bleeds first. The feed cut. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. Across the Atlantic, chaos erupted. Scott Bessent was in a private boardroom in Manhattan, surrounded by advisors, economists, and legal teams who suddenly looked like they'd seen a ghost. The live stream of Traoré's speech was still replaying on multiple screens. Every sentence, especially that final line, echoed like a gunshot across the corporate world. "No one talks to us like that," Bessent growled, tossing a gold-plated pen across the table. "No one shuts us out." His chief legal officer tried to interject. "Sir, if we act now, we can file sanctions claims, trigger arbitration under." "I don't want court papers," Bessent snapped. "I want leverage." But the leverage was slipping. In Paris, the Élysée Palace summoned an emergency roundtable. In London, ministers scrambled to review all bilateral mining agreements. And in Washington, quiet murmurs turned into alarm. Traoré had done what few dared. He called the West's bluff, live, on air, with a grin on his face. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the streets were on fire, not with destruction, but with celebration. Miners marched beside students. Mothers banged on pots from balconies. Young boys painted their faces in gold dust, chanting, "It's ours. It's ours." Inside Traoré's war room, he stood with arms folded, watching footage of the reactions from abroad. One advisor turned to him, voice tense. "Sir, the embassy in Côte d'Ivoire intercepted chatter. Bessent's people are lobbying for covert action. They're panicking. But they're dangerous." Traoré nodded slowly. "Good. Fear is honest. And honesty means they finally see us." He turned to a wall-mounted map of West Africa. His finger moved over regions rich in minerals, lithium, cobalt, uranium. "This is the real battlefield," he muttered. "Not bombs. Not tanks. Resources. And they know it." Another aide entered, breathless. "Sir, calls are pouring in. Mali, Niger, Guinea. They want to follow suit. They're asking if this is a coordinated stand." Traoré smiled faintly. "It is now." He picked up a radio and gave one order, begin Phase 2. And across Burkina Faso, black trucks bearing the seal of the new Ministry of Resource Sovereignty rolled out, one by one, to every mine with foreign hands on it. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would be looted no more. The world didn't blink, it stared. Across Europe, news tickers ran Traoré's declaration in bold. Burkina Faso begins Phase 2, foreign mining operations seized. Financial analysts tried to soften it with terms like nationalization or resource realignment, but everyone knew what it was, a clean break, a revolutionary slap to Western power. And Scott Bessent? He wasn't just watching. He was bleeding. From Wall Street to Brussels, billions evaporated in hours. Multinational stockholders screamed down phones. Panic spilled into gold futures. And behind Bessent's locked doors, a different kind of war plan was being drafted, one not made of bullets, but of blackmail, bribes, and shadows. "This isn't just about minerals," Bessent muttered to his inner circle. "It's about precedent. If he gets away with this, they all will. The continent will shut us out." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré wasn't celebrating. He was mobilizing. He sat at a steel table in a cold underground room, the heart of the new command center. Around him, a dozen representatives from neighboring African states leaned in, studying the map on the wall. Each nation had sent one person, young, fiery, and fed up with colonial remnants. Traoré's voice cut through the dim light. "Today it's gold. Tomorrow, water, lithium, land. Africa's wealth has always been someone else's future. But if we unite, it becomes our present." A woman from Mali nodded. "But they won't let go easily." Traoré looked her dead in the eye. "Then let them try. Back in New York, Bessent launched Operation Phoenix, a covert initiative to destabilize key parts of Burkina Faso's resource infrastructure. Agents, lobbyists, and private military contractors were deployed under diplomatic covers. Their objective? Disrupt, divide, destroy. But Traoré had expected this. Before the first fake protest erupted, before the first fire was set, his intelligence team had already identified the infiltrators. Cameras rolled. Evidence mounted. And within 48 hours, he held a press conference like none before. Standing before a sea of reporters, Traoré played leaked audio, voices tied directly to Bessent's operatives, planning sabotage. Then he leaned forward. "Let this be known," he said, voice low but burning. "Africa is not your playground. And I am not your puppet." The crowd went silent. Then exploded in applause. And in a dark penthouse in New York, Scott Bessent finally realized. He wasn't just losing minds. He was losing control of history. The silence in Bessent's office wasn't peace, it was the eerie calm before financial warfare. He stood before a floor-to-ceiling digital screen pulsing with maps, wire transfers, and coded field reports. Each red dot represented a failed bribe, a captured agent, or an asset turned loyal to Traoré. The empire he had built through soft power, contracts, investments, manipulation, was unraveling. And at the center of this resistance stood a man who wasn't playing the old game. "He's rewriting the rules," Bessent said quietly to no one in particular. "He's making it moral." Traoré wasn't just taking the mines. He was giving them back, to the people. Videos emerged of Burkinabe engineers walking through reopened shafts, this time wearing national flags on their helmets. Cooperative ownership was no longer a dream, it was a living, breathing model. Schools were being built near goldfields. Clinics followed. Profit wasn't vanishing, it was finally staying home. But the world powers saw danger in this. Not because Traoré was dangerous. But because he was working. In Washington, backroom conversations shifted. The State Department began floating narratives: economic instability, potential human rights concerns, burgeoning dictatorship. Sanction packages were drafted under the guise of democratic oversight, while Western media carefully planted doubts about the sudden reforms. Traoré responded with surgical precision. He invited international observers into every corner of Burkina Faso's resource operations. Independent journalists from India, Brazil, and even skeptical French outlets were given unrestricted access. What they reported shocked even them. There was no mass corruption. No disappearances. No violence against civilians. Only steel-eyed discipline, national pride, and a population finally benefiting from its soil. One headline screamed across the Atlantic. "The Burkinabe miracle, Traoré's gold revolution isn't just real, it's spreading." And it was. Ghana began talks. Guinea signaled interest. Even oil-rich Nigeria requested a closed-door meeting. Bessent, watching from his high-rise, knew what that meant: contagion. What he had feared most was happening. Traoré wasn't an isolated phenomenon. He was a spark. The empire of shadow contracts and rigged negotiations was under threat, not because of military rebellion or political upheaval, but because one soldier-turned-statesman had decided to be honest. And honesty, when weaponized, was more dangerous than bullets. Bessent turned to his chief of covert operations. "It's time," he said grimly. "Send the warning." "What kind of warning?" Bessent stared at a photo of Traoré. "One that reminds him, this game isn't over. And the West never plays fair." The threat didn't come in the form of missiles or military convoys, it arrived in silence. First, the satellite feed over Burkina Faso's central mining zones was mysteriously jammed. Then, global markets began to adjust their ratings of the country's resource sector. Over a single weekend, 3 major Western banks froze development loans to West African infrastructure projects, all citing escalating risks stemming from radical policy shifts. Coincidence? Hardly. But Traoré was not caught off guard. In fact, he was already ahead. The gold reserves that once quietly exited through French refineries and offshore funnels had been rerouted. New trade routes, backed by Russian airlift logistics, Turkish shipping, and Chinese alternative finance, circled the embargo like vultures above a wounded beast. Yet these weren't scavengers. They were partners, on Traoré's terms. When the IMF issued a severe risk warning for nations aligning with Burkina Faso's new economic doctrine, Traoré called an emergency press briefing. It was broadcast live, not just across Africa, but translated and streamed to South America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Europe. Standing tall in his military uniform, with dust still clinging to his boots from a recent site visit, he faced the cameras. "If the price of sovereignty," he said, voice thunderous, "is your disapproval, then let your judgment fall like rain, I will not seek shelter." His words ignited a digital firestorm. Activists in Brazil reposted his speech alongside footage of deforestation caused by Western mining giants. Farmers in India shared it, comparing it to their own battles for land rights. Even in Detroit, young organizers, mostly descendants of displaced African families, held a rally, chanting, "The gold is ours. The future is ours." Back in New York, Scott Bessent watched the feed with clenched fists. "This isn't nationalism," he muttered, "it's infection." But what he couldn't see, what he refused to acknowledge, was that this infection was a cure. A cure for a continent sick of extraction and silence. A continent tired of being someone else's engine, someone else's vault. And Traoré, this calm, iron-spined soldier with no Wall Street education or Ivy League polish, was now its clearest voice. But Bessent wasn't done. If public pressure didn't stop Traoré, maybe fear would. That night, a private convoy left a U.S. air base in North Africa. Its destination, a remote border zone known more for shadows than sunlight. Inside that convoy wasn't a diplomat. It was a message. And it was written in a language Traoré would understand. Force. They called it a diplomatic escort. But nothing about the unmarked convoy rolling across Burkina Faso's northern border suggested diplomacy. Blacked-out SUVs, satellite-linked Humvees, and a signal jammer mounted like a predator's eye on the lead vehicle. It was quiet. Too quiet. But Traoré's silence was strategic. Burkina Faso's new command structure, developed with the help of non-aligned military tacticians and battle-hardened veterans from Mali and Niger, had eyes in the sands. As the convoy slithered forward, drones the size of dragonflies circled overhead, undetected. Embedded operatives logged every movement. Traoré knew where the so-called message was heading before Bessent's men crossed the third checkpoint. And he waited. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood in the operations center beneath a wall of live feeds. His commanders were tense, but he was calm, stone still. "They think force is a language we've forgotten," he said. General Diarra, scar-faced and loyal, turned to him. "Should we intercept?" Traoré didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed at a thermal feed. The convoy had stopped, less than 20 kilometers from a village that hosted one of Burkina Faso's new gold processing sites. "No," Traoré finally said. "Let them see what the people think of their message." As night fell, the convoy reached the village. They expected passivity. Fear. Perhaps a few confused elders or children retreating behind doorways. Instead, they were met by rows of torches, villagers standing shoulder to shoulder, blocking the road, unarmed but unmoved. And at the center stood a teenage girl, no older than 16, holding a placard with one word, handwritten in French. Voleurs. Thieves. The lead vehicle halted. Inside, the American agent, officially non-governmental, but unmistakably trained, reached for his radio. Target zone compromised. Locals non-compliant. Requesting escalation. Before approval could crackle back, a voice came through, not from Washington, but from Ouagadougou. It was Traoré. "We don't need weapons to stop you. Our dignity is armed." The line went dead. Panic flashed across the American's face. The villagers weren't moving. They didn't have to. The world was watching, on hacked satellite streams, mirrored live on West African networks and even leaked onto U.S. social platforms. One soldier, unnerved, muttered, "They were ready for us." Traoré was already speaking again, this time at a global forum in Accra. Cameras zoomed in as he declared, "This is not just about gold. This is about memory. This is about how the West forgets what Africa remembers." And for the first time, the West was struggling to forget. But Scott Bessent wasn't finished. If threats didn't work, he'd start buying silence. Scott Bessent sat behind a mahogany desk that once belonged to a former U.S. Secretary of State. It was a relic of empire, lacquered in the illusion of diplomacy, but the briefcase he had just placed atop it told another story. Inside, contracts, stock options, backdoor deals, and billions in promised infrastructure investment earmarked for Africa's resource-rich nations. One name topped the list: Burkina Faso. He had failed with threats. He had failed with stealth. But money? Money had built empires, bought revolutions, and rewritten history. So Bessent flew in. Privately. Quietly. Into a luxury airfield in Ghana under the guise of renewable energy talks. His team secured a high-level bilateral with key West African ministers. And with practiced charm, he laid it all out: strategic development, modernized mining operations, Western capital, and shared prosperity. The room nodded, until one seat remained empty. Traoré. He arrived late. Not because of ego, but because he was watching the reaction, gauging who leaned forward, who smiled too easily, who had already folded. When he finally entered, the room tensed like it had been slapped. Dressed simply, without a single gold pin or ribbon, Traoré sat without shaking Bessent's hand. "You came with money," Traoré said coldly. "So did the first colonizers." Bessent smiled tightly. "Mr. President, I'm here to offer opportunity. Your people deserve roads, hospitals, a future." Traoré didn't flinch. "You built roads last time, to extract. Hospitals, to study our bones. And the only future you offered was servitude." The room froze. Bessent opened the briefcase slowly. "I don't think you understand how much is on the table here." Traoré stood. "I do. That's why I'm about to flip it." And he did, literally. In a thunderous motion, he slammed the briefcase shut and tipped the table toward Bessent. Papers scattered like lies in the wind. "Take your offers. Take your deals. And go back to your crumbling towers. We're not for sale. Not now. Not ever." The ministers gasped. Some recoiled. Others smiled behind folded hands. News spread within hours. In Ouagadougou, crowds took to the streets in celebration. Children painted signs that read, "Africa is not for sale." Drones filmed the protests and beamed them to the world. In Harlem, in Dakar, in Johannesburg, people chanted Traoré's name. Back in New York, Scott Bessent faced Wall Street analysts with sweat on his brow and fury in his throat. "This isn't over," he muttered. And maybe it wasn't. But Traoré had already won. Because in a world still ruled by silent contracts and hidden hands, he'd done the unthinkable. He said no. And the echo of that "no" was louder than any war drum.